But what I really wanted to tap into was a sense of debate amongst our community and to really externalize a lot of what we've been thinking on our own and see how it lands when we share it with people of our community and get them to give us feedback and how does it sound outside of our own heads. I know there are other former podcast guests of Krister's joining us today as well, and everyone adds their own little bit. So I would urge you to share in the chat feature, one thing that you guys hope to get out of our webinar today, and we'll see how, at the end how that aligns with how this goes. And our intention is to make these better each month. So your feedback and your participation will help us increasingly make these more targeted to what everyone wants to get out of these. So thank you for joining us, and I'm excited for the conversation we'll have today.
All right. Well, I think without further ado, let's get into it. And, building on Jason's metaphor of the sandbox, this is really just an open place to share your perspectives, and let's see what, emerges. I think there's, in the coaching field, there's the idea of co-creation, that oftentimes together we can create something together that we can't create alone. And so, today is an opportunity in the, 45 minutes or so we have left to really co-create something and see what comes out of that conversation. So the topic we picked for today was around similarities and differences between team coaching and other forms of team intervention. And part of the reason why we picked this topic, and for those of you who are team coaches and position yourselves out in the world as team coaches, when you start to talk about team coaching to clients, sometimes you get puzzled looks. I've definitely had guests on my podcast who didn't really call themselves team coaches, but when they started to hear more about sort of concepts of team coaching, they said, oh yeah, that's how I can define myself. For others, it's kind of a new way of thinking about one's work if you're working with teams. And so, having some sort of clarity around what differentiates team coaching from other forms of team intervention, but also, is there overlap, and how do we sort of deal with the similarities and overlap? And I think on the podcast interview with Terry, one of the things that was really sort of a powerful moment in our conversation was just around how the coaching field has really evolved from a place of dependency to independence, where it's really done a lot in the last decade or two to differentiate itself from other forms of helping professions, but that now as it moves into maturity, it needs to sort of reintegrate in a more interdependent way. And that's really about sort of preserving the unique identity of coaching, but it's also about really seeing where the overlaps are. And so we thought this could be a really rich conversation to have amongst us today. I know, going back to one of my episodes with Gilbert Brenson Lazan, he sort of coins himself as a facilitator. He was recognized in the International Facilitators Hall of Fame. He sort of, critiqued that there's a lot of debates online about how does facilitation differ from team coaching and from other forms. And, his view was that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, that clients really don't care what it is. But in his view, his stance at the end of the day is that really at the base of team coaching is facilitation. Now, I have a little bit of a different stance on that, and happy to jump in and share a little bit about my view about how they overlap and are a bit different. I guess for me, what I really see is that team coaching is an amalgamation of a number of forms of team intervention. And so what are some of those forms? So on the one hand, you could think of, classic team building or team, consulting to teams. You've got team training as a form of team intervention. You have, process consultation as another form of intervention. And then if you start to bring a coaching lens to that, these are like sort of a set of 4 or 5 different competencies that, for me, I kind of feel like if you can't do all of those, it's really hard to engage in coaching a team. And so in sort of my view around what the similarities and differences are, in a way, I actually kind of feel personally that team coaching in a way is like a meta category that really draws on all forms of team intervention. But I think for me, so in addition to being sort of like a meta competency that sort of brings all these other tools together in an integrated way, I think what differentiates for me team coaching from some of these other forms is really around the idea that sustainable change happens over a period of time. And team building, for example, is oftentimes an event. Team training is oftentimes a one-off event, right? These other forms of intervention, team facilitation is oftentimes an event. But I think where team coaching adds a different sort of layer or lens to it is really about that for change to happen, it oftentimes takes 3, 4, 6 months or longer. And in a way, that's really what coaching brings is a vehicle or a medium of change. And so that's sort of my opening comment to kick it off. And I'd love to get some more of you guys in the conversation and see your reactions to that and to take us in various directions.
Mr. This is Barry.
Yeah.
I agree with what you said. It's sort of analogous to training in an individual. It's kind of a one-off thing, and coaching is more of a sustained thing. So if you look at the analogy of training and team coaching, or training to an individual and team coaching to a team, I think there's some parallels there. Because in our experience, we found that our program is basically a 6-month program, and the changes occur very slowly over time. And then when you finish the program, you typically have something that is long-lasting and enduring.
Yep.
And we found teams have been able to take their learnings over that longer period of time and ingrain them and actually repeat them. And we teach them how to fish. So that can't happen in a one-off event.
Yeah. I really like what you said there, just around it sort of becomes ingrained. And I think for me, the language that I bring around that as sort of an organizational psychologist is around social norms, that it takes time to shape the norms in a team or the culture of a team. And I think what you're describing is that through Team Advantage, after about 4 to 6 months, that actually becomes something that sticks, that's sustainable, right?
Yeah, I think that you have a term for it because you're known as the encyclopedia now, right? With the team you're working for.
Touche. Anyone else want to jump in? And also, the listeners too, feel free to pop on your mic and jump in. We don't have a big group. We have 12 or 15 people today, so I think there's plenty
Cozy
of space.
Group, yeah.
Yeah, Jason, you're about to jump in?
Well, yeah, just to add, so there's the piece around continuity that I think that you and Barry are talking about. Just that team coaching is a systematic process versus an event. And then there's this also, I think that Terry shared this really great metaphor about how we're moving towards integration, and that team coaching, it kind of represents the coherent integration of a lot of different approaches and methodologies, which I agree. I think that a lot of us who have been working in this space have noticed how our practice has gone from kind of like a hodgepodge, a little bit of like in our designs with groups, like there's a little bit of team building, there's a little bit of facilitation, there's a little bit of coaching, but over time these pieces begin to cohere and become something perhaps
it's a gestalt,
or unique. Right. There's also an element that I think is important, and it really, for me, it was really the a huge shift for me when I started working as a coach with individuals, and it's just this notion that our clients, the people that we work with, that we all are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole. And so when you believe that, whether about an individual or a team, what does that require of you as someone who's supporting that process? What is the posture that really supports that really champions that? And so I think that at the and I guess this is where I resonate somewhat with what Gilbert was saying, and it's that if that is my belief, if that is the core belief of my approach to team coaching, then it is much more facilitative, it's much more elicitive than it is a directive process. Would I say it's facilitation per se? No, but it is very much about, it's much more about creating space for the wisdom, for the resilience, for the creativity of the team to emerge than it is for me to train or mentor or direct the development of that team.
I think yeah, there's a lot from what Jason's saying that interests me. I think the first thing that comes to mind is when you had Peter Hawking on, one of the points that he made or that he thought was important to him was this idea that whenever you coach a leader, you're essentially doing team coaching, right? And he mentions how whenever he coaches a leader within the organization, in some way that you're helping that person become a better team coach in their own way, right? And I was listening to Terry's episode this morning, and he talks about how what his method is in terms of how he approaches team leadership coaching, and a lot of it has to do with first coaching the leader and then seeing if the structures are there to coach the team, right? And so one of the questions that's really interesting for me about this topic is, okay, if team coaching is an interdisciplinary practice, as is coaching, there's the ontological question and sort of in my mind it's what's the difference between the identity that we step into the room with versus what we get contracted to do, right? So if we get contracted to do team coaching, but it subsumes facilitation, training, consulting, and coaching, right? There's only so specific a contract that you can make, and at the same time you also have the expectation of what the client how they define coaching, and so it's this really interesting sort of weird micro. It's like bacteria, right? Like it grows from itself and it evolves, and so for me the question is, how is the contract that we receive as a team coach? How does it align with the identity that we step into the room with, right? Because even if we have all different kinds of professional identities that make up facilitator, trainer, coach, we normally step into the room with one, whether it's conscious or subconscious, right? So, I'd be interesting to hear from people how the contract versus the identity plays out when you step either in a group coaching or in a team coaching scenario, and that's something that for me I've been thinking about a lot.
Anybody want to react to that one?
Hey, Krister.
Yeah, jump on in.
Hi, this is Dina. I just don't want to put on the video.
No worries.
Really, but I can see you. But
look, Jason put a sweater on before coming in.
Try to put your clothes on, Jason. Thanks.
Just teasing you.
I'm trying to wonder what part of the country you're in, Jason. That's better.
Are you in Seattle? It's cold in Seattle. Sorry, Dina. Please go ahead.
That's okay. I think Alex and Jason brought up some really important things. I took down a couple notes, and I think that facilitating creates that space, right? So I think when it comes down to contracting versus the identity, when you come into a space with coaching, especially with teams, I think modeling that as a coach is one of the biggest pieces of what we're asking people to do. So one is being able to say we're going to be vulnerable, being able to see that gap. And so it's very intriguing to me, and always has been since my years of leadership in the industry, pharma industry, and being able to take team advantage and some of those key things that I learned in that process. Being able to posture yourself for safety of the team, to be able to explore why they think the way they do, why they react the way they do, to be able to develop themselves to pull that team together. I know that was a lot, but that's really how I see this space. It's facilitating, but we also have to model that space so that people are really aware of what we're asking them to do so that they can see it, because that's not a norm.
Terry, you're dropping some great value, to borrow Alex's term, who borrowed it from me, some value bombs in the in the chat window. I'd love to have you come on the mic and if you're game.
Value bombs. I love that.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
I picked that up from somebody else too. So.
Oh, I wasn't taking credit for it. I was trying to throw in some of your own podcast lingo that people would pick up on. No way, trying to steal that copyright.
Yeah. Anyways, if we can bait Terry in, he's adding a lot of value there in the chat. But
I have a question, Dina, while we get Terry on the microphone, which is part of what you were talking about seems to touch on this idea that once you contract with a team or a group, you have to acknowledge the effect that that the intervener has on the system that they're entering, and by talking about being vulnerable, and it sounds like you very much see the intervener as stepping into that system's dynamic. So I'd be curious to get your sense of whether I understood that correctly, and whether you could say a little bit more about about the role of the intervener who steps into the system itself.
Yeah, so into the system as a coach, is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's being able to stay real with people and understanding that the process of a team evolution and that transformation is going to bring up areas that are going to be difficult, right? And I think pulling that together and being able to state that up front that, this will happen, but it's a safe environment, and we can help navigate that space, and lending people to that opportunity to see what is the reality of the situation, so that you can best address how are they going to react to that, and help them to find some of those solutions together. And that's what's really interesting about this team process, is they end up learning how to help each other do that piece safely.
Okay.
I like that idea about the team helping itself to grow and develop, right? And there'd be the interesting distinction between how the leader facilitates that versus how the team itself as an organism.
Yeah, one of the things, I find too is the leader really does have to stand down. If since I've been on the other side, being a leader who's experienced that process, you have to be willing to be vulnerable, and that's a very uncomfortable place for a lot of people. So back to your point, Alex, unless you have somebody who really understands that role, being able to sit back and say, I want to learn too, and even though I'm a super rock star first line leader, right, I can learn a lot out of this process, and you can learn a lot about the people. So I think you're right. If you don't have that place defined, and then they evolve with that process, right, and then they can step back into that leadership role, being able to take a more meaningful role for each person individually, but for the team as a whole.
I really like that, and what I take from that is the idea that by the leader becoming a part of the team, he or she also generates more buy-in towards his or her credibility once the coaching is over, and they have to continue the leadership of that team outside of the contract of the work. Thank you for sharing.
Alice, sometimes the leader gets to show a different dimension of themselves through the process, and that's a big step. We have found that having a strong, vulnerable, open-minded team leader is almost essential for our process to work. We've tried it a couple times with leaderless teams, ad hoc teams, things have been thrown together. It really wasn't a true leader. It's very difficult. So that dimension of the team coach and the team leader is really important to have a successful outcome. And that team leader tends to get, as Dina can attest to, having been a team leader through a team coaching process, the team leader gets tons out of this if they play hard.
So, love to get some more voices in the conversation here. Anybody else want to jump in? Maybe hasn't had a chance to chime in, either to comment on this or take us into a new direction.
I want to hear from Terrence there, Krista. Yeah. Get him off mute. He's putting equations and everything up here on the box, and he's getting up to New York here, and
he's coming in. He's coming in. Go ahead.
I am off mute. It's been interesting just listening to the conversation. I didn't jump in because I use the chat feature because it was just a great way for me to let the conversation flow and also contribute. So there's so much to zero in on. One thing that strikes me, so I have more questions than contribution per se, but one thing that strikes me is this notion of role identity and role requirements and the alignment between the two, right? Because role identity seems like this inside-out dynamic, whereas role requirements is often this outside-in dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we deal with the two of those? So to me, that seems like a question worth exploring. It's like the interplay between role identity, so the identity that I show up. So I heard a bit, for example, about transformation. And I hear a lot of that when I listen to coaches talk. And my experience, particularly in corporations, is oftentimes we're joining a team that may not be ready for transformation. So the work often may be instrumental and transactional, and that we actually sometimes have to do that work in order to earn the right to do the more transformational work. And so sometimes my identity, that I see myself as a person who needs to transform something in order to add value, can sometimes, not always, but sometimes be at odds with the requirements of the team in terms of work. So I think that for us as team coaches in general, is a question worth exploring. You know, Ron Heifetz, for example, talks about the nature of the work ranging from being operational, which is more task and instrumentally oriented, to adaptive, which is more transformational. And so how do we make those choices as coaches in general, and team coaches in particular, and what's the interplay between our identity and the requirements?
Terry, could you explain a little bit deeper the metaphor of inside out, outside in, as it relates to role identity?
You know, so role, the inside out is my identity. So I think my understanding of that dynamic came when I was doing my dissertation work on diversity practitioners.
Okay.
Senior most person responsible for diversity in an organization or consultants. And one of the things they had talked about was what were the requirements of the role, which was often defined outside of them, you know, by the CEO or whoever their sponsors were. And yet a lot of what they talked about during the interview process were the values and assumptions that they brought to the role and what happened when those weren't congruent. Right? So my identity, the way I see myself and show up to the work, is inside out. It starts with my values and beliefs, and then shows up in terms of how I do the work, whereas the requirements of the work are often happening outside of me and moving internally. So there's that dynamic between inside out identity and outside in requirements, and how do we as practitioners deal with that interplay? That was a salient theme. And so when those two things are congruent, there were great things that happened in terms of diversity work in organizations. When those things weren't congruent, sometimes the interventions would have some results, but there was quite a bit of process loss.
The question that comes to mind for me is, if you had a conversation with one client in two different dimensions, and you had one dimension be the initial conversation be an outside-in conversation, and the second dimension be an inside-out conversation, how does the contracting become affected, you know, beyond that point, or does it eventually come to a point where it converges? In other words, how you start to have the contracting conversation, does that initial point determine from the very beginning the outcome of the engagement, or is it a difference that gets blended out over a period of time? I guess is a very abstract question that comes to my mind. I don't know if Terry, if you have a comment on that, but that's just sort of what my
yeah, go ahead.
Similar to coaching, diversity practitioners often are working with individuals, groups, and systems. So they're working at multiple levels of an organization. And so I don't see it as a linear process, meaning you start with inside out and go outside in. It's a concurrent dynamic. And so I think all of us have an identity, which is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And there's also, even as individuals, there's a reputation. That is the story others tell about us. So that dynamic is always occurring between my identity and my reputation. And I think similarly, I as a professional, I have a point of view about how this work is done. And these frameworks, at least for me, the framework of operation, what's the nature of the work, operational and adaptive, is really important because I know I have a personal bias toward transformation.
Right.
So I have to really zero in on saying, is that my point of view really showing up in terms of the contract?
Right.
Or is there direct observable data that suggests that's actually what's really needed? And frankly, I think coaching draws a lot of people that are interested in transformation. And I just wonder sometimes if we're not being as process effective as we could because we don't tend to focus on the transactions or operations as well.
You know, Terry, this may sound like a real simplification of what you're saying, but you're using the term inside out, and I've been on a plane quite a bit recently and been watching a lot of movies, and there's a movie out there called Inside Out. I don't know if you all have seen it.
Yes.
That's a phenomenal movie, yeah.
Yeah. So the reason why it comes to mind, not just because it has the same title, is that the moral of the story is that all of these human emotions that we have a place, and then when we try to separate ourselves from certain emotions, it creates havoc or it creates disorder within the system. And I think a lot of times the way I relate this to what you're saying is that it is true that for many of us, depending on the school of coaching that we come from, we glorify the process of transformation, whether at an individual or team at the team level. That's what we're aiming for. We're trying to evoke transformation in our clients, which can be a very powerful thing to have someone who is trying to evoke transformation in you. And at the same time, the developmental requirements of the client may not be calling for transformation at this time. It may be calling for incremental change. It may be requiring just very concrete steps. And so as a team coach, it becomes really important to get beyond our expectations, our hopes, our frameworks to really see where the team is. What are the developmental requirements of the team? What are the role requirements of me as a coach? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Sometimes parents are just looking for an increase in sales. You know,
Performance.
they're just looking for a result. And I think your discussion is great, and I think it comes back a lot to the self-awareness that the coach has to have, and sometimes you've got to let go of your preconceptions. You know, we do a lot of, before you start entering a room with a team, you've done enough reconnaissance that, yes, some biases are formed, but it's the ability to let go, and I hate to use a term that I think is overused, but, you got to be present with what's going on. And but you're right. Sometimes we're not trying to transform. Sometimes we're trying to get a business goal met. And in that process of meeting a business goal, some magical things can happen if you maintain that coaching space.
Yeah, what's resonating for me is just around how do we define transformation, and is it big transformation? Is it little transformation? Is transformation just another word for change? And I'm thinking about a team advantage engagement I'm involved in now, and what I would say what's happened there is a kind of transformation. It's a little bit more internally facing. This team has really, what I would say, has really moved. If you think about Katz and Box's and Smith's developmental model of when a team moves from being a working group to a pseudo team to a potential team to a real team and then a high performing team. This is a team that sort of, I would say, probably operated more like a working group, and through the coaching has become a real team. But they've kind of, taken care of themselves such that they actually now have reached sort of a developmental stage where I think really what's next for them after this 4 months is where they're really going to be able to light it up, and really move from more of an internally facing developmental threshold that they reach to something that's more externally facing. And that's happening already now, that as they become more effective as a team, they're starting to have an impact on the environment. And I think this is what Peter Hawkins would say when you look at his team coaching continuum, is that teams really can be sort of more internally facing versus externally facing. But at some point, really the greatest transformations come when a team starts to transform the environment that it's a part of, right? Not just itself. So I guess the way I'm thinking about transformation is more on a developmental, as a developmental process. I mean, we talk a lot about high performing teams, but I think a lot of the teams that we use that label with are really not high performing. I think they're becoming real teams that have the potential to do something extraordinary. I don't know. That's sort of my thought about that.
Well, I think that's part of it, right? Today, an organization is quick to assemble a group of people and slap the label of team on them and simply expect them through the magic of something just to become a team and not necessarily stay a group, right? And I think the other thing that when you were breaking down sort of the definition of transformation, it seems like there are two parallel conversations here. How the coach, the sort of coach's hero or coach's savior would define transformation, right? And wanting to be the catalyst for a transformative change, and how the client would define transformation, right? And both the definitions would be different. Transformation may not be this huge system changing agenda on one and on the other. It's more about the ego and the values at play, right? So it seems like there are parallel conversations being had about what transformation is, depending on whether it comes from the perspective of the intervener or from the agenda of the organization.
I dropped in the chat window there, my reaction to your question, Terry, is I think, if we want to define transformation, one way would be to really look at outcomes. And, I go back to some of the work of, Richard Hackman around how do you measure, team effectiveness or team outputs. And so he talks about performance. So delivery of products and services as measured by the consumers of those products and services. Does the team actually grow and develop new capabilities? So the capacity building part. And then there's the third one, which is around, is that sustainable over time, right? Because you can have a high performing team that has learned, but has burned itself out in the process and isn't going to be able to perform in the next cycle. So I would suspect that transformation really could occur on multiple levels, but I find sort of looking at the outcome metrics as maybe a good way to start thinking about how do we actually define transformation. I'm curious what others think about it. Also welcome on some other folks who haven't had a chance to chime in if you want on this topic or others. Yeah. I think this topic of transformation may need to be a webinar topic in and of itself, right? We haven't really unpacked that enough, but it's a good start today.
We could come up with multiple definitions for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Barry, you guys, with the team advantage, I mean, it's I think one of the subheadings is a total team transformation. So I'm curious, how do you guys view transformation? Do you have is it more of a concept, or have you broken that down into some metrics or measures? Or
well, again, listening to the discussion is great because I think we can play with this word a lot. And transformation, I don't know if I can put a metric on it. It's more of a feel when you're done with the team. It's kind of like a vibe or an energy that you feel when a team has gone through the process and they're willing to do more than they had before. They're communicating at a higher level, and therefore they've accomplished something they didn't think they could achieve. And that alone is moving the needle. And particularly the teams that take what they've learned from the process and move forward on their own, I think is a very nice indicator that something has happened, that now they can do something on their own that they weren't able to do before in a different way, in a more fluid way. So I don't know if I could put a finger on the definition, and thanks for calling that out. That we do call it team transformation. Now I'm thinking, okay, how do we really define that? How do we put a metric to
Yeah.
it? Of course, we have done metrics on things, such as engagement and high performance behaviors and all that stuff. We have measured, whether that's transformation or just a movement of a metric. It's all a good point.
Yeah. I mean, Jason and I are both trained in the coactive model, and one of the four, pillars of the coactive model is evoking transformation. So, is that defined by the client? Is it defined by the coach? Is it, an external referent? It's interesting, on the podcast, Phil Sandal from Team Coaching International was one of the few coaches that really had a very explicit metrics-based approach to team coaching. And so it's kind of interesting that measurement tends to lag practice. I mean, because it's hard, it takes another set of skills to do it well. But definitely it seems like the field of team coaching, really, this is an area, and if we could start to operationalize transformation a bit more, then we might be able to measure it. So, and there's that saying that you tend to get what you measure. So, yeah, it's interesting that we throw the term transformation around a lot, and we haven't really, gotten into the breaking that down.
Finding a client that's willing to invest in the measurement is the key, at least for us. If you can find somebody who's willing to say, well, let's do the program and we'll measure. We've been fortunate to have that happen twice. That's where our measurements come from. But we always throw it out there to them. Would you like to put some metrics to this? And sometimes they don't really care. They just want to get it goes back to what I said earlier. Some people just want a sales result.
Right.
They want to move the needle on a business metric. They don't care about the transformation, so to speak.
I found with a lot of my clients, they want evaluation and measurement, but they don't want to pay for it.
Exactly.
So, which usually means that it doesn't happen, right? Unless you're willing to pony up to do it yourself, right?
Or we need to find somebody like Terrence who's got deep research pockets to be able to do it.
Exactly. So Terry says here, maybe in a more general conversation that frames the range of work from transactional focus to transformational focus, a continuum. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, the transaction transformation.
The reason why I said that, Krista, is it seems to me in order to define anything, you're often comparing and contrasting it. So in order for me to truly understand transformation, I almost have to understand what's on the other end of the continuum, right? Because it is that notion, the way we make meaning, even the way the brain makes meaning, is through similarities and differences. So when we want to really focus on a concept, generally the way that we understand it is almost what's its opposite, or what's its continuum. So, and it's interesting to me that whether you look at the Burke-Litwin model, or whether you look at Heifetz, or whether you look at a lot of these organizational thinkers, they use that range. Heifetz calls it operational and adaptive. Burke-Litwin calls it transaction and transformation. But almost no matter what organizational model I look at, I see that range of work.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder. It's also interesting to me as I explored different coaching programs that exist. I think we all have, most of them I saw had a lot of emphasis on transformation. And I saw very little emphasis on transactional or instrumental work. And yet, in my 20 years plus in corporate, it feels the exact opposite. So in terms of really starting, Krista, you and I talked a lot about metrics. And part of that comes from, I started in sales. And so my experience in organizations is the language of business is money, and the alphabet is numbers. So I don't think you have to come up with a separate way of evaluating. I think you have to build evaluation into the work,
right?
And then they'll pay for it, because now it's not something extra.
Right.
But if you try to frame it as something separate, they're not going to pay for it.
I'm also I'm thinking, Christopher, you mentioned developmental transformation in the context of developmental transformations. And I think one question that I think is helpful for me is when progress is made, when movement is occurring for a team, it's helpful to kind of get a sense for like how different is this from the default mode of operating of this team. And so kind of looking at it from a developmental framework, there are certain developmental milestones, and like there is, for example, to borrow from Robert Keegan's work, at a certain point, the individual is stuck in a concept of relationship that is purely reciprocal. There is no sense of mutuality. And so the developmental process for that individual is little by little beginning to understand and create space for the idea that there is that is not just about what I can get from this person or from what they can get from me. And bargaining and negotiating is kind of the primary mode of interaction, but that there is also, I can also do something in service of the relationship that we have. And so I guess the way that I use, and I'm very reluctant, to be honest, to use the word transformation, but perhaps where I see the term useful for me is to what extent are certain actions or certain commitments transformational in nature, in the sense that what is the qualitative shift that they're inviting for this team? Right. So there are goals that we can set that can kind of move us an inch forward. There are also goals that we can set. There are goals that have an energy that can completely take a team from one place to another. And to a point where going back to a previous way of operating, it would be inconceivable, right? And so I think as a coach, seeing the opportunities for that, for those qualitative shifts, is a really important part of the work. I think it's when you aren't open to those moments to those possibilities of qualitative shifts, I feel like the life of that engagement begins to kind of drain out. And so I think it's a really valuable conversation to have, because I agree with Terry. A lot of times we're much more skewed on one end than the other, because it just sounds more exciting. It sounds sexier to talk about transformation than it does about the more operational side of things. And as coaches and as team coaches, it's a really critical part of our work to be sensitive and attuned to when possibilities for much more radical change is present.
Well, I think that was really powerful. I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is this idea that we talk about transformation and change almost interchangeably at different parts of this conversation, right? And for me, I think of Arnold Bissier's like the paradox of change in Gestalt and OSD, and the concept that it would seem like change is about moving us away from where we are, where change is often most effective when it helps us become more of what our system most organically is, right? And I think when we talk about developmental transformation, there's this notion in our mind that it's about moving the team or the group away from where it is towards some future desired state, when in reality it's not necessarily about moving it away towards it, but about understanding the current system that exists, and how are you as intervener actually changing it to become more of what it wants to be, not necessarily away from a point, but almost collapsing like a black hole into itself.
This goes back to sort of, it's beautiful, Alex, that a team is a potential to be realized or unfolded, and it's not so external. I mean, oftentimes the change in the external environment necessitates intrinsic change, right, or internal change. And I love what Terry's saying here around instrumental, socialized, and the self-authoring. I mean, those are Keegan's, higher order stages of development. And, I'm thinking of this team Jason and I was working with, and, oftentimes I think we actually find teams struggling around issues around authority and around the relationship with the team leader, which for me oftentimes indicates that they're probably at an instrumental level of development as a collective. And in some ways, I suspect, and I think this has been commented on the literature, high performing teams are very rare. So the majority of teams probably are really at those earlier stages of development, right? And so what I find with a lot of the teams I'm working with, the reason why we're being called in is there's lack of alignment, there's lack of trust, there's the seeking of collaboration, there's struggles with the leader. All of those symptoms to me are indicators of a stage of development that's really more in that Keegan's, third order of consciousness or that instrumental stage. And I don't know, Jason, if you would concur, but I felt like our work last week, and the reason why it felt the beginning of transformation for that team was really, I think, starting to move from an instrumental to a socialized fourth order as a collective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to incorporate what Alex just said, it was not because we deemed that was the transition, that was a change that needed to happen. It was what the team valued. It was a core value of that team that had not been acknowledged.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we actually had an interesting yeah. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, I was saying again, I love what he said about people sometimes working with a team. It really is not looking beyond them. It's really putting a mirror to them and having them look at where they are and shifting how they see that. So I think what you said, I think that's where you were getting, but it's critical, and that's I think where the role of a coach really comes into play, is to get to ask the questions that make people think about those things. Keeping yourself in that coach mode, I think it's powerful. So I agree 100% with the point you were making.
I think one of the spaces for us to continue this conversation next time is, okay, if at first we talked a little bit about how team coaching is facilitative, then we're now at a point where we're talking about team coaching within a coaching context, right? And how are there differences between the coaching and the facilitative and the consultative and the training aspects of all of this? Because even though it's made up of an interdisciplinary practice, are there any differences between the definitions that we use, whether they're facilitative, consultative, or coaching? And I really like this notion that you were touching on when you and Jason were riffing on the almost the developmental stages of the teams that you've been working on themselves. That seems to mirror what Terry was talking about earlier about the developmental stages of even team coaching as a field, right? So thinking of the teams that you're working with along the spectrum of where they are developmentally might be a good place as an intervener to put your head on your shoulders from.
We did. We actually presented the Katzenbach model, and we sort of just put it out there. And I think for the team, it was really helpful. We didn't ask them where they were. We just kind of planted the seed, and I think it really started to help them really start to, and it was sort of like not until we got to the end of the second day that I think they probably could have actually placed themselves on that curve, right? Because they didn't have enough context to be able to find that. But, going back to sort of the topic of today's webinar, I'll sort of make a final comment. We could do a round of final comments for folks who want to weigh in. Was that funny, Jason, or something else?
No, it's just like I feel like it's a great comment, and I just feel like
okay, go for it.
The conversation has gone so far beyond.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of the sandbox, right? You can change the game.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I'm in the right place. My mind is in the right place. So
I guess the way I see it is, if you look at the arc of a team coaching engagement, all of these tools or skills, consulting, facilitation, training, process consultation, coaching, they kind of tend to be the hero, or to use Terry's metaphor, like in an orchestra, certain parts of the band get to be put in the spotlight. And so on the upfront work, you're doing contracting, you're sort of doing the needs assessment. A lot of those are like classic consulting skills that haven't changed. If you go back to Peter Block's book on flawless consulting, a lot of that stuff is consulting. You get into maybe you start coaching the leader in the process of that. You go to a 2-day or 3-day kickoff meeting where it's largely facilitation, but Jason and I were playing around starting to coach the team in moments during that, and using process consultation at moments where we abandoned the team to a task and watched them try to accomplish something and then made interventions, right? And then you start to get into the period following those kickoffs, and we actually did a little bit of training elements as well, some micro skill building for the team. And then we sort of, wrapped up with an ongoing process of coaching where coaching is going to be the hero. It's going to be the front and center of the ongoing, sessions we're going to have with the team. But all together without each other, you couldn't coach the team, right? And so I guess that for me is the way I grapple with it. And I think sometimes our brains like to reduce things down into some simplicity. It's easier for me to call myself a facilitator or a process consultant or a coach, rather than seeing that all of these are actually, especially in a team coaching context, are really all needed. And I sort of feel like there are 4 or 5 buckets of competencies that we need to be skilled in to really do team coaching well. So anyways, that's my sort of final comment. Love for you guys to share one too, and if anybody else on the call wants to make a final, comment or add a perspective before we end the session today.
Yeah, or even if you wouldn't mind sharing a takeaway from this session in the chat feature, we'd love to read it and have that and see what people are taking with today. And please do reach out to us with topics that you might want to hear about for our next webinar. It's, and join us again, and we'll continue this conversation.
Maybe we can run through the list of participants. Fernando, we didn't get to hear from you today. If you feel like coming on and sharing a thought, feel free to do so. We have Irvinia Waters. If you feel like jumping on, feel free to do so. Karen, Blair, Terry, Raphael. Anybody, any of the other participants care to make a final comment? Closing comments. Terry, Jason, Alex.
Christopher,
yeah, go for it.
Terry here, as people are thinking, your last comment, which I think relates back to the framing of, what are similarities and the differences between team coaching and other sort of group level interventions, does raise the question for me that if team coaching is an extension of coaching, executive coaching, or however we focus on the individual coaching, then how many of those competencies are transferable? And importantly, what else do we need to know? And so, for example, you've mentioned facilitation skills, which be explicitly in the repertoire of additional coach training programs, for example. There could be an action research component, i.e. data collection, analysis, feedback, sort of the or process consultation, however you look at that. There could be there are often times where I step out of those roles and move into a laser learning intervention mode, right? And so when we're moving from the individual unit of analysis, going back to Lewin's equation that behavior is a function of the person in the environment, I think coaching, until we expanded to team coaching, was very heavy weighted on the person side of the equation. And we were hypothesizing and theorizing about the environment because we weren't there, right? And team coaching, I think, helps us bridge the individual to the organization.
That's right.
And therefore, what additional competencies do we need for this work? I think it is a question that's worth exploring. It's one I have a lot of energy around based on our conversation.
Yeah, maybe another potential topic for a webinar.
Yeah. Christopher, and this is not to open up that whole topic of conversation at all.
Sounds like you're leading that way, but go ahead.
No.
Plant some seeds. What do you got?
No, definitely. As a seed for a future conversation, I think that it's we can talk about the differences between team coaching and facilitation, but then there's also the conversation around what is the difference between individual coaching and team coaching. What more is needed? And that's what I heard what Terry was saying.
Yeah.
I think that when we're working with groups, there is this tendency to want to attune to every single member of the team and look what are the needs of this individual member and this individual member, and so the facilitator, if you will, or the coach kind of finds him or herself in the shouldering the task of responding to each individual need. And I think that is an exercise in futility. to be honest. The larger the group becomes, the more untenable that is. And so I think that one competency around this, and this is also part of my answer to a question that Terry posed about how to negotiate or how to navigate different developmental levels within a team. And I think it's really, one competency is really around understanding, being sensitive to the energy of the team, the climate of the team, and what that space is calling for. What type of energetic shift is that space calling for? So it's kind of looking at the team beyond the collection of its members and really getting a sense for what is this team creating together? What is the entity that this team is creating together? And so we had a lot of experience working with that with this team, and so I think it's a really valuable conversation, because I think it's a core part of what makes a team coach.
Well said. Well said. Alex, do you have a closing comment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about this conversation and the ones that we'll keep having. I think, and something for me that comes to mind is that I love the idea that Terry finished off here with. What are the similarities between executive and organizational coaching for individuals, and what are the competencies that are different within team coaching, and how are they subsumed within each other? And I think that's something really interesting to think about. The second thing for me is, I think there's some mathematics once the field gets more evolved here. I think that there might be even some correlation between, for example, the equation of evolution with with a possible equation for human behavior and team coaching, and then, or fields that relate to helping others. And that's a really abstract thought that I had, but and then I think for us to continue to grow as a field, whether it's in these webinars or in other conversations, we need to invite people that are that have an identity outside of coaching and consulting, whether it be therapists or put themselves first as facilitators or whatever it may be, so that they can hear us and say, oh, well, this is interesting, I see this differently, and to really continue to grow our conversation, not only through sounding boards that are similar to each other, but through sounding boards that are perhaps going to challenge some of our assumptions, because a lot of us are reading very similar material and learning from very similar thought leaders, and I think injecting some different professions into our conversations in the future is going to be an important way, and maybe opening this up to people who are interested in coaching, not as an identity, but as a toolkit or something, right?
So just to build off of something I heard DJ Mitch say a couple of weeks ago, just, team coaches all sitting around together, navel gazing together. There's a certain amount of value in that. But one of the things I really liked is, we had Dina Riedinger on the call today, who actually was a frontline leader in pharma and now is making a transition into coaching and team coaching. So she really comes to this from a very different angle. I came to team coaching as a learning and development professional with a background in training and facilitation and process consultation. So all of those things really link up easy for me. I know she had to drop off the call, and I would have loved to heard her talk about, when she hears all these terminologies around process consultation and facilitation, if you're not a learning and development professional, does that is all of that like a different language or not,
Yeah.
So I like your comment there. We could really diversify the audience of who's in the conversation. That would be rich. Good stuff. So if there's any other final comments, feel free to jump on. We have a couple comments in here. Raphael, shared a little bit. Great conversation. I ended up with lots of questions to dive in and continue reflecting on. From being part of a large international organization, I can see the relevance of the topics discussed have on things we deal with every day. Terry, like to comment that you made, Jason, around bringing up the notion of unit of analysis or focus when coaching a team. Karen Blair says, thanks for the discussion. Each conversation deepens my understanding. I would like to hear more on team coaching competencies distinct from individual coaching competencies. I think we may actually have our topic right there for the next webinar. I'll put that out there as a suggestion. We'll see. Appreciate your time and commitment to this. And Terry, an action commitment. I want to do some thinking about how to scale the work of coaching in and for organizations, including one-on-one executive coaching individual level interventions, team coaching, group level work, and systems level coaching work. Sounds great, Terry. So everyone, really great having you on today. We're going to be back next month. We will put up pretty soon on the Team Coaching Zone website the next webinar and the topic, and we'll be back, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. I think, again, using Jason's metaphor, this was about a sandbox to play around in. And what I love about having a free-flowing conversation is we created something together as a group, right? It wasn't a presenter just sharing content, which is one way of learning and adds value in a certain way, but we went off on all kinds of interesting tangents today around transformation and developmental theory. So I think that usually makes for a more rich conversation. So thanks everyone for joining. And if you have suggestions, I'm going to drop in the chat window here an email address if you want to be in touch with us. But you can always go to the teamcoachingzone.com website if you want to find out a way to reach out to us. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. So have a great rest of your day. Stay in the zone, everybody. Take care.